Introducing corpus annotation, Geoffrey Leach. What is corpus and what is corpus annotation? Traditionally, linguists have used the term corpus to designate a body of naturally occurring authentic language data which can be used as a basis for linguistic research. This body of data may consist of written text or spoken discourses or samples of spoken or written language. Often it is designed to represent a particular language or language variety. In past 35 years, the term corpus has been increasingly applied to a body of language material which exists in electronic form and which may be processed by computers for various purposes. See Leach 1991, Leach and Fligel-Stone 1992, Church and Mercer 1993, McHenry and Wilson 1996. The power of computers has increased dramatically. The corpora handling also has increased dramatically. It is fast becoming a universal resource for language research on a scale unimaginable 36 years ago. The mentioned period of 36 years is not fortuitous. The year 1991, which more famously saw the first manned space flight, is the date to which the Corpus Linguistics started. Corpus Linguistics, or more precisely, Computer Corpus Linguistics. This was the date when work began on first electronic corpus, later to be known as Brown Corpus, or Brown University, after Brown University Providence, RI, where the corpus was compiled. The corpus consisted of just over 1 million words, comprising 500 text samples of about 2,000 words each. The samples were all taken from the publications in the year 1961, and the corpus was complete and ready for distribution on magnetic tape in 1964. As an indication of how the size of corpora has increased since 1964, 1 million word Brown corpus might seem to be a little small today, beside the corpus products of the 1990s, including the 100 million word British National Corpus BNC completed in 1994 and containing 10 million words of transcribed speech, and even larger Bank of English, which runs to more than 300 million words. However, the value of a corpus as a research tool can be measured in terms of brute size. The diversity of the corpus in terms of the variety of registers or type texts it represents can be equally important. So, too, can the care with which it has been compiled, for example, with respect to the faithful encoding of orthographic features of the text. A fourth factor, the degree to which added value is brought to a corpus by annotation, is the subject of this book. Corpus annotation is widely accepted as a crucial contribution to the benefit of corpus brings, since it enriches the corpus as a source of linguistic information for future research and development. Further, as this book will aim to demonstrate fully, corpus annotation has become an important and fascinating area. But what is corpus annotation? The practice of adding the interpretive linguistic information to an electronic corpus of spoken or written language data. Annotation can also refer to end product of this process. The linguistic symbols which are attached to it are interspersed with the electronic representation of language material itself. A typical and familiar case of corpus annotation is grammatical tagging, also called word word class tagging, part of speech tagging, or POS tagging. In this case, a label or tag is associated with a word, example by some kind of attachment symbol such as underline character or slash character to indicate its grammatical class. For example, in taken VVN, the grammatical tag VVN shows that taken is a past participle. The definition of annotation above, and in particular the use thereof, the terms interpretive and linguistic, requires some further discussion. First, by calling annotation interpretative, uh, all right. We signal that annotation is, at least in some degree, the product of the human mind's understanding of the text. This is no purely objective, mechanistic way of deciding what labels or labels should be applied to the given linguistic phenomena. Disagreement is unlikely to occur if we label taken as a past participle, which is conventionally the grammatical class it belongs to in English. But there are many other words which would be more contentious. For example, future his future bride. In his future bride, it is a noun or an adjective. What is it? Is it a noun or an adjective? Or to take up a question of how much detail, delicacy, or granularity, other terms you often used for detail, should be encoded through annotation. If future is an adjective, should it be labeled as an adjective of a particular subclass, say the class of the adjectives which must occur in a pre-nominal position? We can say his future bride, but not his bride will be future. Decisions about these and many other matters have to be taken when we set out to annotate a corpus. Before second, we go to the BNC sample, which is this. Now, examples of grammatical tagging using the C5 tag set of the BNC. So here we have sentences, and with words, individual words of the sentences, we have the grammatical taggings. So high winds and heavy seas have been causing further problems in the southern part of Britain, leaving homes flooded. Okay, so everything has a tag in it. High winds NN2 and CJC, it's something like conjunction, right? Heavy, adjective. Seas, noun, have, verb, so things like that. Second, we assume a distinction between the annotation and representation of a text, a distinction which may be easy or less easy to apply. For a written text, generally these two kinds of information are relatively easy to separate. The purely orthographic record of a text is a sequence of written characters from, say, Roman alphabet interspersed with spaces and punctuation marks, with occasional use of visual material, numerals, and non-standard characters such as mathematical symbols. This record can be represented electronically in the computer by special codes and markup, and a one-to-one mapping between these and visual symbols can be maintained. The original orthographic document is simply replaced by an unambiguous representation in the form of an electronic document. It is true that some more or less detailed information may be lost in this process. Example, font and type size may no longer be retrievable, but this is felt to be allowable if such information is not just to be essential to the representation of the text, as linguistic phenomena. In contrast to this, the annotation of a text is metalinguistic. Instead of telling us what the text itself comprises, it gives information about the language of the text. For a spoken discourse, however, it is not easy to distinguish between representation and interpretative information. In rendering speech in written or electronic form, except where the representation is purely instrumental, as in the case of acoustic waveforms, a transcriber must necessarily interpret the discourse in the course of representing it. Most transcriptions, as a matter of convenience, incorporate conventionally spelled words using phonetic transcription, if at all, only for exceptional pronunciation, but this merely gives superficial readability to speech events whose real nature, physical, linguistic, or social, may be vastly more complex and elusive. Prosodic labeling of stress and intonation, for example, is to some extent dependent on the judgment and expertise of the transcriber. Knowles, 1991, as well as on the system of analysis adopted. There is no doubt that prosodic labeling at one level is representation of a part of the data of a speech event being transcribed. However, there is equally no doubt that prosodic labeling is in part an interpretation of the event through the auditory perception of this or that listener, even where the perceiver is a highly trained phonetician. Pickering et al., 1996. For the purposes of this book, we have decided to give some attention to phonetic and prosodic annotation as types of annotation, while acknowledging their in-between status. Although the distinction between the raw corpus, some prefer pure corpus, and interpretative annotations can be somewhat artificial, it is nevertheless a useful distinction, since we should not see annotations as having the claim to reality and authenticity which belongs to the corpus itself. For a written corpus, the text itself is the data. In the etymological sense, data are givens, and the annotations are superimposed on it. For a spoken corpus, the recording is what is given, and it can also be maintained that a bare verbatim transcript of what was said is itself a kind of secondary given, that is, a written record without any addition of less reliable, less clearly definable information. Beyond this givens, it is difficult to go without implicitly taking up some descriptive, interpretative stance towards the data. Why annotate a corpus? Why is it important to be able to annotate a corpus? 1. Extracting information. Corpus are useful only if we can extract knowledge or information from them. The fact is that to extract information from a corpus, we often have to begin by building information in, that is, by adding annotations. The raw corpus, in its orthographic form, contains no direct information, for example about grammar, and this can hinder many of the applications to which corpus can be put. Consider the word spelt, left. As a word meaning the opposite of right, it can be an adjective, my left hand, an adverb, turn left, or a noun, on your left. As the past tense or past participle of leave, it is a verb, I left early. Left is therefore a very versatile piece of language, but its various meanings and uses cannot be detected from its orthographic form. This is a disadvantage for one of the most salient uses of a corpus in recent years. Its use as a resource for lexicography. But if a corpus is successfully grammatically tagged, each occurrence on left will be accompanied by a label indicating its word class. This is a prerequisite for anyone using a corpus for making or improving dictionaries. To take another example, the word spelled lead in English can either be a noun pronounced lead or a verb pronounced lead. If we want to create a machine for converting the written language into auditory spoken output, a speech synthesizer it is necessary for a synthesizer to distinguish the noun from a verb if it is to produce a correct pronunciation. Once again, a grammatically tagged corpus would provide the synthesizer with the information it needs. Reusability, the second point. It might be argued that to extract information of the types mentioned above, there is no need for an exhaustive annotation of a corpus. It might be sufficient to run a clever little program to recognize that, for example, left preceding a noun is an adjective. In, let's say, you say, left column. Give me the left column. So that's an adjective, right? Or that left following a verb is an adverb. So let's say a girl is laying and she says fuck left, fuck left. So right, so a left following a verb is an adverb, right? Such little programs could run on the fly, extracting instances of the target word without undertaking any annotation. However, such an argument has two weaknesses. First, it is evident from the example of the left that in order to identify the word class of the target word, we would also have to presuppose the knowledge of the word class of the neighboring words. In other words, the identification of the word classes or any other linguistic phenomena cannot be treated as an isolated problem. Second, the point about grammatical tagging and other levels of annotation is, once annotation has been added to the corpus, the resultant corpus is more valuable resource than the original corpus and can now be handed on to other users. This argument of reusability is a powerful one. Since corpus annotation tends to be an expensive and time-consuming business, we do not want to waste resources by reinventing the wheel time and time again. That is, by reanalyzing or reannotating the same corpus material. An annotated corpus, like any corpus, is valuable because it is a reusable resource. Multifunctionality, the third point. Taking the point about reusability one step further, we may note that annotation often has many different purposes or applications. It is multifunctional. We have already noted the application of grammatical tagging to the two applications of lexicography and speech synthesis. Other language engineering applications, such as machine-aided translation or information retrieval, could also be mentioned. But the general point to make is that annotation gives added value to a corpus in the general sense. It adds overt linguistic information which can then be used for a multitude of purposes. Thus, grammatical tagging is often considered as a kind of base camp annotation which can be the first step towards difficult levels of annotation such as those of syntax and semantics. The reusability of annotated corpora is enhanced by the fact that there are many different purposes for which others may wish to make use of annotations, purposes which the original annotators of the corpus may not have even thought of. Some standards for corpus annotation. Our acceptance of annotations as useful and informative must depend to a considerable extent on our evaluation of the experts who added them to the corpus, and of the usefulness of the annotative scheme they have adopted. In the short history of corpus annotation, it has been by no means unusual for the builders of a corpus to add to it annotations which others have found difficult or impossible to use. To avoid this situation, we suggest that a number of practical guidelines or standards of good practices should apply to any project of for annotating corpus texts. First, it should always be possible and easy to dispense with annotations or to revert to the raw corpus. The raw corpus should be recoverable. Second, the annotations should correspondingly be extricable from the corpus to be stored independently if there is a need. Third, the user of the corpus should have easy access to documentations which will include information on the annotation scheme, that is, a document describing and explaining the scheme of analysis employed for the annotations. Second, how, where, and by whom the annotations were applied. Third, further, since annotations give a typical size of annotated corpora, quite often contain erroneous, inconsistent, or ambiguous elements, there should be some account of the quality of annotation. For example, to what extent has the corpus been checked? What is its accuracy rate? That is, for example, the percentage of the annotations which are judged correct, and to what extent is the application of annotations consistent. On a more philosophical level, the following additional maxims apply generally both to the compilers and users of annotated corpora. For the reasons already given, and there can be no claim that the annotation scheme represents God's truth. Rather, the annotation scheme is made available to a research community on a caveat emptor principle. It does not come with any gold standards guarantee, but is offered as a matter of practical usefulness only, on the assumption that many users will find it valuable to use a corpora with annotations already built in rather than to have to devise and apply their own annotations. Fifth, therefore, to avoid misunderstandings and misapplications, it is a good idea for annotation schemes to be based on as far as possible on consensual or theory-neutral analysis of the data. Perhaps the best analogy here is to the kind of structural or classificatory information given in printed dictionaries. A dictionary gives information about the grammatical classification of words, for example, but tends to take these as given by general descriptive traditions rather than as coming from some theoretical model that has to be justified. While annotators are bound to face some theoretically sensitive decisions, their goal should be to adopt annotations which are as widely accepted and understood as can be managed. Perhaps it should be added that the existence of the content of consensual categories is not itself a matter on which it is easy to gain a consensus. No one annotation scheme should claim authority as an absolute standard. Annotation schemes tend to vary from good practical reasons. For example, the size of the corpus to be annotated may militate against too much detail. The purpose for which the annotations are primarily intended may give priority to certain kinds of information. Example, a corpus which has been grammatically tagged mainly as a preliminary to parsing may need may need careful discriminations. So, corpus which has been grammatically tagged mainly as a preliminary to parsing careful discrim may need careful discriminations to be made between different kinds of subordinating or coordinating conjunction. The kind of corpus data, for example, spoken versus written, or the identity of the language, that is, Greek versus Chinese, may also encourage differences in the annotations to be applied. Yet, in spite of six above, there is much to be said in favor of some kind of standardization of the corpus annotation practices, and it is likely that convergence towards some degree of uniformity of practice will take place in next few years. Indeed, this convergence has already begun. One reason for standardization is inertia. If you are familiar with some annotation scheme that you have found useful, say the pen tag set for the grammatical tagging developed at the University of Pennsylvania, Santorini 1990, it makes sense to stick to that one in developing your own annotated corpus. Another reason is the already emphasized principle of reusability. If different researchers need to interchange data and resources such as annotated corpora, this is more easily achieved if some standards or guidelines have been applied in different centers. The need for some kind of standardization of annotation practices is particularly evident when we come to the mutual exchange of corpus software utilities. Authorities who fund research may also find it desirable to exert influence in the direction of standardization. This has been recently noticed in the policy of the European Union in setting up the Eagles Initiative. But the need is to encourage the convergent practice without imposing a straitjacket of uniformity, which would inhibit flexibility and productive innovation. 1.4 A glance at the history of corpus annotation. Beginnings of grammatical word tagging. To our knowledge, the first computer corpus annotation project was undertaken was the word class tagging of the Brown corpus under the supervision of the founders of computer corpus linguists Francis and Kuchera. This was undertaken by the two MA students at the Brown University, Green and Rubin 1971, using a tag set of 77 different word class labels. This was soon after the completion of the Brown corpus itself. As may be supposed, such a large list of word class tags would identify not only major parts of speech, noun, verb, preposition, etc., but also values defining subclasses such as singular and plural forms, plural nouns, positive and comparative, and superlative adjectives, and so on. The outcome of this pioneering experiment was that 77% of the words were successfully tagged and disambiguated. There still remained the considerable task undertaken in the following years of eliminating all 230,000 of the remaining ambiguities by manual editing of the corpus. See Francis 1980. The experiment of Green and Rubin eventually led to an extremely useful product, the word class tagged Brown corpus, which has since been used by many thousands of researchers all over the world. But the interest of the tagged method of tagging is that it helps to identify, even at this pioneering stage, a number of general characteristics of corpus annotation. One distinction often made is between automatic and manual annotation of a corpus. Green and Rubin found it necessary to adopt an automatic tagging method, but the completion of this task was a tedious and time-consuming manual editing of the whole corpus. This division of labor between automatic and manual methods is a recurring theme of corpus annotation, with a number of variations beyond a given corpus size depending on the size and complexity of annotation. Purely manual methods are impracticable. At the other end of the scale, purely automatic annotation can only be tolerated if the result of the annotation is good enough to use it as it is, that is, the error rate or ambiguity rate should be sufficiently low, no more than n%, where n is small number dependent on the application, to make the annotated corpus practically useful. A second major tagging project in 1979-82 was the tagging of the British counterpart of the Brown corpus, the LOB corpus. Marshall 1983, Garside et al. 1987, chapters 3-5. This time, the tagging software employed probabilistic methods. Those tagging the LOB corpus were fortunate enough to be able to use the tagged Brown corpus as input, especially as a source of tag transitional frequency data. The success rate of automatic tagging leaped from 77% to 96.7%. However, a consequence of the probabilistic method was that the tagger clause inserted the most likely tag in every position so that wherever it failed it made errors. That is, 3.3% of the tags were erroneous and had to be corrected, not merely disambiguated by hand. After Clausey, a number of world-class taggers were devised, many of them using probabilistic methods, for example the taggers of Church 1988 and De Rose 1991. A number of themes which recur in corpus annotation made their appearance in the decade following the LOB tagging project. The choice between probabilistic and non-probabilistic methods is still a bone of contention. Also, as the LOB tagging project shows, a probabilistic model requiring a training corpus, a corpus preferably already annotated, which supplies initial estimates on the basis of which the probabilistic annotation software is trained. In the case of Clausey, this was generously supplied by Kuchera and Francis, the authors of the previously tagged Brown corpus. Another interesting observation is that both Taggart and Claus, in spite of their different methods of tagging, used a very limited context, one or two words to the left or to the right, to determine the correct tag for a word. This, again, is a recurrent issue of corpus annotation software. How far can we get by using extremely local information as a basis of automatic annotation? A final thing to note is that both Taggart and its successor Clause operated on the English language only. For a long time, and indeed up to about 1988, very little annotation of corpus for other languages took place, largely, no doubt, because such corpora did not exist. Since 1990, however, the annotation of corpora has extended to many other languages, example Chinese, Japanese, French, German, Polish, and Spanish, and there has been a move toward the development of language-independent corpus annotation software, especially Cutting et al.'s 1992 Xerox Park Tagger. A boom in grammatical tagging began in about 1987. Since that time, many taggers have been developed for different languages. Now, however, it is time to backtrack to the mid-70s to trace the development of other levels of annotation. 1.4.2 Beginnings of prosodic annotation. Since written corpora are easier to collect and compile than corpora of spoken discourse, it was Not until the mid-1970s that a first major attempt was made to establish a computer corpus of spoken language. This was the London Corpus LLC, which was in fact a computer-readable version of spoken materials from the Survey of English Usage Corpus, eventually 500,000 or 5 lakh words, which had been compiled in paper form at the University College London from 1960s. The name London derives from the fact that the computerization was undertaken at Lund in Sweden. See Swartwick 1990. The LLC was also the first electronic corpus to have prosodic annotation or transcription built into it. The stress, intonation, pauses, and other prosodic features has been transcribed in great detail over the preceding 15 years or so in London. See Pepin, 1995. Another landmark worth mentioning was the completion in 1986 of the Lancaster IBM Spoken English Corpus (SEC). Although much smaller than LLC, combined different levels of annotation within the same corpus. The same spoken texts were provided with grammatical tagging, syntactic annotation, and prosodic annotation, as well as with coexisting orthographic and digitally recorded versions. Beginnings of syntactic annotation. Beginnings of syntactic annotation. The mention of the syntactically annotated version of SEC, which is Spoken English Corpus, brings us to the another part of the annotation story, the development of corpora with syntactic annotation. In the early days of electronic corpora, a pioneering effort by Ellegard 1978 and his industrious students at Göteborg, Sweden, produced a hand-parsed section of the Brown corpus. The Gothenburg corpus, as it has been called, consisted of samples amounting to 128,000 or 128,000 words. In the early 1980s, a team at Nijmegen began the Tosca system for parsing corpus sentences. See Van Halteren and Oosterdijk 1993, and the team at Lancaster who had tagged the Loeb corpus attempted the parsing of the same corpus by probabilistic methods. Garside and Leach 1985, Garside et al. 1987. Although hardware and software limitations prevented the completion of the task, in the later 1980s and the early 1990s, the building of tree banks, that is, parsed corpora, took off as a major activity. It was becoming recognized that syntactically annotated corpora were an important resource for the development of NLP software, for example, in the development of robust wide-coverage parsers for such applications as speech recognition and machine-aided translation. The Lancaster IBM tree bank compiled in 1987 to 91 comprised about 3 million words. Leach and Garside 1991 and the Penn Tree Bank Initiative, Marcus et al. 1993, brought the fruits of this new technology to wider public of users. The convenient term tree bank, commonly used for syntactically annotated corpora, brings to notice the fact that the phrase structure PS remains. Tree remains the favored basic model for corpus parsing, being a more complex and resource-demanding task than the grammatical word tagging. Corpus parsing lags behind grammatical tagging in all respects. It began later. It has been less successful, and it has been liable to great inaccuracy, ambiguity, and incompleteness. Earlier attempts at parsing have had to do with the simplified constituent structure models, and hence the term skeleton parsing or skeletal parsing was used to characterize the initial Lancaster, IBM, and Penn tree banks. Leach and Garside 1991, Marcus et al. 1993. Corpus parsing is still an evolving technology, but it has It is evolving at a rapid rate. The current state of art will be further discussed in Chapter 3, but it is worth noting here that whereas the first tree bank, the Gothenburg corpus, was entirely annotated by hand, we are now reaching a stage where automatic parsing without existing post-editing is becoming practicable. This trend is perhaps best illustrated by the constrained grammar parser of the Helsinki group, Carlson et al. 1993, which, although its output is a partial rather than the complete parse, does run relatively satisfactorily over large corpora, and has indeed been used to annotate the Bank of English corpus of more than 300 million words or 30 crore words. The constrained grammar formalism is notable for incorporating a dependency grammar framework in contrast to the PS models employed for the most other tree banks. Towards the other end of the spectrum of size, but equally significant in this way, is the Susan corpus, which is manual reworking in considerable detail of the Gothenburg corpus, each decision being justified by a detailed parsing scheme published in book form, Samson 1995. As with tagging, syntactic annotation has a methodological continuum running from entirely automatic to entirely manual. Somewhere on this continuum is the potentially interactive method employed with increasing success by Nijmegen Group, Arts et al. 1993, Van Halteren and Oostdijk 1993, where automatic parsing takes place in an environment allowing or requiring intervention to complete the task of satisfactory parsing. Other levels, although most of the effort on corpus annotation so far has gone into work with at the word class and syntactic levels. Other levels of annotation are now beginning to take off, for example, semantic annotation and discoursive annotation. Section 1.5 looks at the different levels of annotation which already exist, summarizing the current status of progress in chapter 2.2 to 6. These will be explored in great depth. 1.5 What levels of annotation exist or can exist? Up to now, different levels of annotation have been applied rather patchily, as the list in box 1.2, working from least abstract to the most abstract levels of analysis indicates. The right-hand column indicates the relevant chapter or section of this book, as every one of these types of annotation will be discussed and explained in later chapters. The brief illustrations in box 1.1.3 are all that are needed at this stage. 1.3, 1.2 levels of corpus annotation, levels of level, linguistic level, orthographic annotations carried out so far chapter of this book. So orthographic linguistic level, this is generally considered part of markup, but see 1.51 phonetico-phonemic linguistic level, widespread in speech science but typically collected in laboratory situations. Prosodic linguistic level 2 or 3 prosodically annotated corpora are available for widespread use. Part of speech linguistic level, that is grammatical tagging, the most widespread type of corpus annotation which is applied to many languages. Syntactic, that is partial parsing. This is the second most widespread type of corpus annotation and is rapidly developing. Chapter 3, semantic. Some exist and more are developing. Chapter 4, discoursive linguistic level. Little exists, but some is developing. Chapter 5, pragmatic or stylistic linguistic level. As for discoursive annotation, box 1.3, brief illustrations of levels of annotation. Example 1.1a, prosodic annotation or London corpus. Well, that sign facing up. Very nice to see you. Bracket open, double brackets come and double bracket close. underscore space spare the apostrophe. No, this is exclamation mark. Okay. So slash facing right to left, moving right to left, and then slash moving left to right. I'm and hash, then sign facing up, come and exclamation T slash facing left to right, facing downwards, arc, hash. Okay. Now example 1b. Grammatical tagging from pen tree bank using the pen tag set. Origin slash NN, off slash IN, state slash NN, automobile slash NN, practices slash NNS. Now these are sentences where every chunk is divided. Every unit is named accordingly. Origin of state automobile practices. The practice of state-owned vehicles for use of employees on business dates back over 40 years. Example 1c. Skeletal parts in a syntactic annotation from the spoken English corpus. Okay, bracket open, parenthesis, bracket open, S, parenthesis, bracket open, and Nemo underscore NP1, comma, underscore, comma, bracket open, and the underscore 80 killer underscore NN1. So this is 1C. Example 1D. A type of semantic word tagging where every unit has a specified name. There underscore Z5 apostrophe S underscore Z5 bean, there's bean underscore A3 plus more underscore N5 plus violence underscore E3 minus. Okay. Example 1E. Discursive annotation anaphoric. 0 in brackets. The state Supreme Court has refused to release parenthesis open 1 bracket open 2 Rahway State Prison to close inmate and parenthesis close double parenthesis close bracket open 1 James Scott 1 bracket close on bail. This is discursive annotation. Orthographic annotation. Orthographic annotation might seem to be a contradiction in terms since we have seen orthography represents text, while annotation interprets the text linguistically. However, up to a point, orthographic information can be interpretive in distinguishing the linguistic functions of various visual devices on paper. Consider the different graphological signals for indicating the beginning and the end of quotations, single quotes, double quotes, change of type size accompanied by indentation. These are different in form but alike in function. Conversely, we can also say that a single mark is unitary in form but ambiguous in function. It can signal a single closing quote, or it can represent an apostrophe. Hence, when we read friends out of context, we have to keep both possibilities in mind against the background. The TEI guidelines, Sperberg, McQueen 1991, Sperberg, McQueen and Bernard 1994, allow us to use a pair of symbols and quo, which means beginning quote,
begin quote, and equo, which is end quote, which signal these orthographic functions irrespective of the typographical device used. This TEI markup may be regarded as a kind of orthographic annotation. Other ambiguous orthographic devices which might be annotated to resolve ambiguities are: 1. Initial capital letters signaling the beginning of the sentence or the proper noun. Second, a period, which may signal either the end or the of a sentence or an abbreviation. Third, italics, which may signal a cited expression, an expression italicized for emphasis, etc. In some cases, these distinctions have been made in the encoding of the orthographic record of a text and have hence made a useful contribution to the corpus processing and annotation at more abstract levels. For example, in the LOB corpus, the symbol slash from left to right facing downward 0 was used to signal a word abbreviation. Johnson et al. 1978. So that, for example, for slash left to right facing downwards 0 in as an abbreviation for inch could be automatically distinguished from the preposition in at the end of the sentence. However, in general, such orthographic annotation has not been consistently applied to corpora, so that it would be unwise to rely upon it in designing software for corpus annotation. Additional types of annotation. First, there are some levels of linguistic structure or function which could be indicated by annotation, although we know of no generally available corpora annotated at these levels. For example, at phonological level, corpora could be annotated by syllable boundaries. At the morphological level, corpora could be annotated by their morphological structure in terms of prefixes, suffixes, and stems. Previous experience suggests that even if no need for such levels of annotation has yet appeared, such a need is quite likely to arise in the future. Second, there is a level of lexeme annotation or lemma annotation. These are alternative names for the same concept. When we have talked of grammatical word tagging previously, we have been assuming that, for example, eat and eats, ate, eaten, and eaten receive different tags according to the morphosyntactic function as a past verb, ing form of the verb, etc. However, another approach to the grammatical word tagging would give each of these same tag and indicate that they all belong to the lemma. Eat, lemma, begin more or less equivalent to the head word of a dictionary entry. In English, lemma annotation may be considered somewhat redundant, since English is a language with simple inflectional morphology, but in more highly inflectional languages such as Russian and Spanish, there is a relatively large number of word stems per lemma, so that lemma annotation may have a valuable contribution to make to information extraction, for example, for the improvement of dictionaries or computer lexicons of the language. Third, there is a kind of annotation which does not depend on the simple recognition of different levels of linguistic function, but is more closely geared to applications. Thus, there have recently come into being a number of learner corpora of English, representing the language of those learning English as a second or foreign language. Example, Granger, 1993. The function of such corpora is to advance our knowledge of how languages are learned as a second language. For example, to what extent does the English or non-native speakers reflect the influence of their native tongue? For this kind of investigation, it is very useful to annotate the corpus with classes of errors or features of non-native language behavior. Such error tags make use of grammatical and lexical classifications, for example, but also take into account the relation between the non-native and corresponding native phenomena. Error tagging of learner corpora is just one example of application-oriented annotations, and these and there may be many more. This is sufficient to indicate that annotation is an open-ended area of research which is very much under development, while in the next 5 chapters we review levels of annotation which already exist. It cannot be doubted that new kinds of annotation will arise in the future.
Grammatical tagging, Geoffrey Leach.
In this and the following chapters, we take a closer look at the linguistic nature of grammatical annotation comprising grammatical word tagging and syntactic annotation. The reason for considering grammatical tagging and syntactic annotation together is obvious. They both, in a general sense, specify the grammatical characteristics of a text. In fact, there is a strong argument that these are not really distinct levels at all. Grammatical tagging is merely a specification of the leaves or pre-terminal nodes of the phrase structure tree, which is favored model for syntactic annotation. No doubt, in a decade or two, there will be adequate work in corpus parsers which will carry out both levels of annotation as a single integrated process. Nevertheless, at the present time, grammatical tagging and syntactic annotation are often considered separate tasks, the former being preliminary to the latter. Considering the difficulty of the task of parsing unrestricted text, it is in any case a useful expedient in the present state of art to divide the work of parsing into two manageable, though individually quite complex tasks, rather than to attempt the more challenging task of integrated corpus parsing. So, yes, this is how trees are made. The sentence divided into last year the workforce grew. So and noun goes down to AT and NN1. The grew is VVVD. A tagging system 2.1. When beginning the task of grammatical tagging, the annotator has to consider at least three questions. How to divide the text into individual word tokens or words. First, how to choose the taxet or a set of word categories to be applied to the word tokens. The second question is to how to choose a taxet or a set of word categories to be applied to the word tokens. And the third question is how to choose which tag is to be applied to which word token. These are basically linguistic questions. The answers to them will add up to linguistic specification of how the tagging is to be done, which may be called the tagging system. However, these answers are also likely to be heavily influenced by non-linguistic issues, such as, first, is the task going to be performed automatically or manually, or more likely, automatically with manual post-editing? Second, if there is going to be automatic tagging, what are the techniques and capabilities of tagging software? Third, what human and hardware resources are available for the task? Fourth, how quick, how accurate, and how consistent does the resultant tagging need to be? However much we may want to ignore these practical and technical questions, the answers to them are likely to prevent us from achieving a linguistically optimal result. In fact, it is rather artificial to separate, for example, the choice of taxet from the development of a tagging software, which may well be proceeded in parallel with the development of the entire tagging system. When undertaking a corpus tagging project, annotators often begin with a rough outline of tagging system, and this provides a set of preliminary guidelines which will undergo revision and refinement as the project progresses. For both the annotators and the users of the corpus, the answers to questions 1 to 3 above are best handled by a tagging manual completed at the end of the project, retrospectively taking account of any changes introduced in the course of tagging. This documentation should be available to users and should ideally be distributed. Two good examples of tagging manual are those for the Loeb corpus, Johansson 1986, and for the Susan corpus, Sampson 1995. 2.2 Tokenization, Multiwords, Merged Words, and Phantom Words. The first issue in 1 to 3 above is to how to